everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our first episode of Building Value and Innovation Ecosystems video conversation series for this year. We're really excited to launch our series this year with Ben Downing from the MIT Engine. Ben, thanks so much for being here with us. Do you mind just sharing a little bit of your background with our audience?
Sure, Saba, and yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Ben Downing. I'm the Chief Growth Officer here at the Engine. The Engine is an incubator and accelerator for tough tech, tough to commercialize technology, generally at a convergent point and a breakthrough in science, technology, and engineering to take on one of the biggest challenges facing society, generally in climate, health, and advanced systems. We're home to about 100 plus companies across 3 locations. Our main location is right in between Kendall and Central Square in Cambridge, about a 155,000 square foot facility here. And we, through the infrastructure, programs, and ecosystem that we provide or convene, try to fill the gaps for tough tech teams as they grow and scale so that they can more quickly get out into the world and solve big problems, create new industries, and grow jobs across the country.
So, what trends are you seeing in this space, and how are they shaping the future of innovation as you think about tough tech and the kinds of problems that they're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think so. The engine was created a little over at this point, 7 going on almost 8 years. And I think when you think about that time horizon, when the engine was first created, there was not a central place for or a home for, a hub for a lot of these potential founders and teams, right? When President Rife at MIT began the process that would ultimately result in the engine. His observation was that there was this incredible work going on at academic research labs, and yet it was not being commercialized, licensed, or otherwise for its highest public impact, right? There was a story of a team at Liquid Glide whose technology that made it easier for liquids to move, in and around a variety of different systems was commercialized to get more ketchup out of a bottle, and not maybe to do a quicker blood transfusion or to make a more efficient, use of a vehicle, in any number of different applications. And I'm the dad of a 7 and a 4 year old boy. Ketchup is like the fifth food group in my house, so like that's impactful, but maybe it's not impactful in the way that we want it to. I think the incredible thing, thanks to the work of folks at the Engine and a lot of affiliated partner organizations over time, is that not only can we say that there are support for these type of teams now, but there are support from a variety of different organizations and teams across the country, right? Public, private, and otherwise. And so you're seeing, more and more diverse universe of capital providers come in to the tough tech space, understand that this is not a simple sort of software, 1 to 3 year model between your check and your return, but that there is massive potential upside long term if you are aligned with the science and the technology. So I think like the trends for us are all upward, right? Challenges for sure, and by no means is any of this work easy, whether that's on the scientific side or the business side. But every day we get to come here to this place and work with these incredibly inspiring founders and teams, and they give you a reason to be hopeful about the future. That we've got the solutions, we've just got to find a way to get them out there into the world.
And how much do investors, capital partners, how much are they understanding sort of the value proposition of tough tech? Are you seeing some unique? What are some unique challenges that you might face in communicating that value prop? Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's a whole nother thing when you're talking about a specific team, a specific technology, and where they're at. So we work with folks in a variety of different ways, right? So we work with teams that are here physically in residency at the Engine. Generally, those teams are spinning out of academic research labs, like 45 to 50% of them coming out of MIT. We're by no means exclusive to MIT affiliation, so we want all the teams in our region to be here if this is the right place for them. And then through our Blueprint program, we work with early stage technologists and founders who have an idea and are trying to figure out what commercializing that tough tech would look like, what it would take. And then we also work with ecosystems through our work through the National Science Foundation. And one of the sort of the through lines through all three of those intervention points, right, is that maybe the biggest hurdle for any of these teams is that first gap, getting out of the academic research lab and getting into the right place for them, right? And if they're here in our ecosystem, we're trying to make the case that it's here in our space. In say for your blueprint teams, they're just trying to figure out like, all right, I got to defend my PhD more often than not. What is the timing of this? Do I have access to the technology? Negotiation with the TTO, TLO, what have you. And then in some of the NSF regional innovation engines, it's more about how do we make sure that we have both awareness of the IP being developed and the teams trying to develop it, and then the right set of supports around them, especially in ecosystems where you might not have the density of entrepreneurial activity that you have here in the Bay or in Austin, New York, Chicago, what have you. So it's that first leap, and generally it's the capital providers for that first leap, right? Like who's gonna see the value of $100 or a $200,000 check to a venture that may require 50 to $100 million, if not beyond, in their initial A and B rounds before they even start to think about, commercialization and revenue generation. So I think it's more of an education and awareness gap, and the more reps that capital providers get seeing these teams, I think the more comfortable they get with it. But that is certainly one of them, and one that we're trying to work to think about how we can help close, whether that's just connecting folks, but also if there's a specific intervention at our level as well.
Yeah, so there was a lot of things that you mentioned there, and I'd like to dig into a couple of those. So one, Ben, could you tell us a little bit more about the Blueprint program and how, how organizations or universities, institutions, if they were interested in engaging in the Blueprint program, what does that look like? Is there an application process? What does that look like? And then I'd love to dig a little deeper into your work as sort of the builder platform for the NSF engines. What are you seeing there? What role? Clearly, there is a role for public and private partnerships and policy to play, and we saw that in the previous administration. And so I'd love to just understand the impact that you've seen with the engine so far, and how the MIT engine, etc., contributes to that work as well.
Yeah. So first on Blueprint, right? Blueprint is a program created by the engine in response to a gap that we saw in the entrepreneurial education support accelerator marketplace, right? When the engine was first created, and we still hold this in our ethos now, we by no means want to feel like we have to create all of the content in the world. We know there's a lot of good people, partners, teams, organizations out there trying to help these teams as well too, right? And so we don't need to recreate the wheel. But one of the things that was observed 7 or 8 years ago was that there was, a disconnect between the entrepreneurial education accelerator world and the needs for and the challenges for teams commercializing tough tech, right? That many of the programs that were out there were more focused on minimum viable product and not focused on maximum public impact, right? And so that perspective required a different intervention, a different course. And so the Blueprint program is a twice a year, no cost, no equity accelerator program. We generally have between 65 and 80 teams, somewhere on the order of like 125 to 150 entrepreneurs, technologists, and founders who come into that program. It's a multi-week virtual program. We've made some adjustments for our spring 2025 offering, but it'll be about a 7, 8, 9 week program when all is said and done. The applications are open until March 10th of 2025. So I'm not sure when our go live date is here, but more likely than not, it will be open when folks are listening to this. We encourage folks to share and share that, share it with founders and teams who you think might be interested and encourage them to apply. Generally, it's a program for technologists, entrepreneurs, and founders who are somewhere in the 24-month window from when they're going to defend their PhD or look to be spinning their technology out of whatever lab setting that they're currently in. It's by no means restricted to folks coming out of academic research labs. That's just the overwhelming majority of folks who we ultimately work with. We find about 50% of folks who participate in the program come from the greater Boston area, but excitingly, 50% are from across the country, and we generally have a couple of folks who are international in every cohort. Really, the only filter is like, do you need the program? Is your technology tough tech? Is it one of those scientific and engineering breakthroughs that's going to benefit from a unique set of offerings tailored specifically to you? There's some parts of the program that are general entrepreneur and founder support, helping you understand sort of the logistics of setting up a team. But then also there's a significant amount that is specifically tailored, focus on some of the unique challenges on the regulatory side, financing first of a kind, unique aspects of a techno-economic analysis for tough tech. All of those pieces brought together over those 7 to 9 weeks of the program that ultimately comes together in sort of a final bonanza showcase day where we have all of the teams in person here. And it's really just great energy, and we try to bring those teams together along with alumni, bring them together with capital providers and others to make sure that they have access to the expertise that's ultimately going to help them grow and scale, right? So we love the program. It's a ton of fun, and it also is a great sort of entry point for teams to the tough tech ecosystem. We see probably about 20% of the teams at the building here have come from the tough tech ecosystem.
Okay, so related to that, and I do want to get back to your work with the NSF engines as
Yep.
well, but when you mentioned a lot of different kinds of support, support services that the blueprint provides and the engine provides. So what are some things or lessons that traditional startup support organizations might learn? Because you mentioned there was, you do a lot of different kinds of analysis. What recommendations would you provide them if, as they're looking to, make their startup support organization much more robust and much more sort of, improve and increase the value that they provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one lesson for me, and this is going to sound more cliche than I wanted to, but I think it's true of the work that we do with the residents that we serve here at the Engine. It's true with Blueprint teams. It's true of the work that we do through the Builder platform with the NSF. And that's to listen first. I think there are a lot of assumptions that get brought to this work. And I mean, we've all been guilty of it. We all run into it in one form or another. But one of the things that we've really spent a lot of time over the last year doing is building up our capabilities to not only collect data, quantitative and qualitative, but to be able to process that data and turn that into the type of offerings in infrastructure, program, and ecosystem that will ultimately benefit the teams that we serve or the regions that are trying to serve teams from the NSF perspective, right? I think it's pretty easy to, read a couple of academic papers, a couple of journal articles, and say, I've got all the answers. One of the great things of us operating a facility, a building here, right, is that you learn a lot of the day-to-day challenges that these teams have. And then, we can help them think about what that's going to look like in the future when they ultimately grow and scale out of here. And I think, I think it's a lot more fun to talk about sort of some of the glitzy side of it. But if you can get your deck right, you can get your techno-economic analysis right, you can have the best science, best team, and then you pick a location where you're going to grow there for 3 months instead of 3 years, and it doesn't have enough power for you. And oh wow, like you got all of that right, but you didn't do your clean air and clean water permits. And wait a second, you can't even operate there, right? So Odds are, we've seen some version of just about every challenge that a tough tech team can face. But we still try to come to every conversation listening first, and then trying to take what we've listened and learn from other teams, and then use that to help the next person that we sit with grow and do this quicker than the last one.
So for regions that are trying to build their own deep tech, tough tech ecosystems, what do you believe are the most sort of critical components that they should put into place to help startups working on these deep technological challenges?
Yeah, so I think it's think about what separates you first, right? And I think this is something that so I grew up in Western Massachusetts, which, for folks outside of Massachusetts, I think generally there's an assumption that the state is like Boston and Cambridge and nothing else. And I grew up way out on the New York Vermont border. And the community I grew up in, Pittsfield, is was a General Electric company town, right? At one point, the city was 70,000 people with 15,000 GE jobs, right? And by the time I was growing up, we were down to a couple of hundred, and the city was 45,000. And both growing up there and then representing the area in the state senate, we dealt with a lot of the challenges of like, what don't we have and how do we fill it back in and how do we get that? And I think with a lot of our work with the NSF, I think the inspiring thing about the work those regions are doing, you see it some with the tech hubs and others as well, is that they aren't starting by saying, what don't we have? They're starting by saying, what do we have and how do we build off of that, right? And so an innovation ecosystem in North Dakota focused on ag tech is going to look significantly different than an innovation ecosystem in Austin. An innovation ecosystem in the Bay is going to look significantly different than one built around industrial carbonization in Louisiana, right? And so think about what the strengths are first in that community. Um, Strengths, and then go to challenges and figure out how to use those strengths to address those challenges. And I think, when we've been lucky enough to work alongside some of the partners in the NSF funded regions and observe some of those in the tech hubs and others, I think the exciting thing is the conversation is not a here's what we don't have and we need from you. It's a here's what we have and we want to use to help take on some of these big challenges. And then that gets really exciting, right? Like we have these moments of like, oh, there's this great ag tech team who we work with every day here at the engine. Let's make sure they're connected with the team, at North Dakota Farms. Or, that's awesome. We just ran into a new team using a nanotech membrane to try to address PFAS. And it's like, oh, awesome. We're going to connect them with the Great Lakes Renew Engine. Here's a fit here. And it's not to say that there's entrepreneurial activity in all of these places, just sort of how we ratchet it up, sort of the different levers is going to look different, right?
Yeah.
There's less industrial fabrication space here in Boston and Cambridge, but when I talk to founders and teams, it's like, don't think the whole state is Harvard Square to Logan Airport, right? Like there's great opportunity if you want to grow in Western Mass or Central Mass, and that same sort of dynamic is there with the NSF engines as well. So I think it's focusing not on like, oh, we've got a thing. The scariest thing for us in this building, or when people come here to visit, is they're like, all right, so we've built a building. What do we do next? And like, I mean, I hope we have good poker faces because part of us dies anytime anyone says that. It's like, don't build the building first. Do all of the stuff to the point where you're like busting out at the seams everywhere else, and then talk about like if you need the building and if so, why and what's the value of it, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, um, you talked a lot about some of those, those collaboration opportunities and that like cross-pollination that can occur when you realize that, especially with the NSF Engines Builder platform, that when you're working with a larger set of innovation ecosystem players and the startups within that, that you can create those opportunities for collaboration and complementary activity. So from your perspective, Ben, what do you think are the biggest opportunities for tough tech in order in addressing those global challenges like climate change, healthcare, infrastructure? What are you most excited about?
Um, that's like I feel like that's like some version of like asking someone to choose their favorite kid, right? So my career has been focused on climate. I was chair of the Energy Committee of Massachusetts for 6 of the 10 years I was in the Senate. I did solar and storage development for 4.5 years before coming over here. And I think like the tricky thing with climate work sometimes is that it's this massive problem and then it's a daily grind. And I think you can get caught in between the two. Um, but I think being around here, just seeing all of these founders and teams, whether it's on the generation side with fusion and new versions of fission and deep geothermal, right, is all incredibly inspiring. And then you have this whole bucket of industrial decarbonization technologies, low carbon cement and steel, industrial processes, chemical separations and otherwise, things that, a liberal arts background, right? Like I knew at the very high level, but then
Right.
see, like I didn't know that was a problem, but you've already got a solution. That's incredible, right? I think for me, it's the climate technologies, not that the stuff on the health and advanced system side. It's all incredible. But the climate work is the work that like I try to share with a lot of my friends who've worked in environmental organizations and other places, because I think that work can be really tough and you don't get to see a lot of the solutions. And I try to tell everyone, I'm like, I'm just spoiled. Like I'm around solutions all day and it gives me reason to be hopeful, regardless of what's going on, sort of outside the walls of this place, right? So yeah, I feel really lucky in that regard. And I also feel like I completely avoided answering your questions.
But I think that was it was one of those hard questions of like, pick your favorite child. But I think we're happy with the climate tech work that you talked about. I think it's one of those. It's a project that our team has also partnered with the Engine on, with the Cradle to Commerce
Yeah.
initiative, with the labs and everything. So it is very close to us as well. Um, so related to that, when you talk about sort of funding in tough tech, what are you seeing? Because if you look at sort of the larger, broader financial space, right, the capital space within startup support, it's drying up. So how are you seeing some of those ramifications in tough tech, or are there novel mechanisms that are coming about and people are seeing, capital partners are seeing the value of tough tech? What have you seen in your work?
Yeah, so I think capital markets are going to ebb and flow, right? Not to, like easy for me to say. I'm not the founder out there fundraising, dealing with it, and we try to help founders and help connect them wherever and whenever we can. And I think a lot of them get again, it's this like big picture, like two things can be true at the same time, right? Like that big picture, we feel really good about more and more capital providers coming in. Short term, this year, man, can I get there this year, and what does it look like, right? I think, and this is like um, incredibly timely. I think, you had a period over the last, we'll call it, 4 or so years where a lot of the founders and teams felt like, the wind was at their back, especially on the public policy side of things with the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS Plus Science, Inflation Reduction Act, never mind state level policy interventions as well. And I think those interventions brought back a lot of capital providers that may have not yet been ready to jump in, especially on the climate side of things. Um, I think what we see when we see capital pulled back to a degree, right, is that founders and teams um, have to get creative, right? And whether that is, thinking about how they're sequencing their jumps out of the lab, right? So is it if we're going to leave, whether they're here at the engine or somewhere else, we maybe it's not two jumps, a smaller lab that we then build out of, but it's just going to be one, and we're going to hold here, sort of as long as we can, and then really be ready to go. Um, I think you see a particular challenge for the the most capital intensive of these industries, right? So I'm mindful we work with a handful of teams that are on the quantum hardware side of things. And there is just some level where you've kind of got this gap between, your ability to raise a seed round between 5 and 10 million, and then all of a sudden you've got to get to 50 pretty quick. And I mean that those are straight hardware investments, right? And um, building building a viable capital stack there is challenging. No two ways about it. So I think the trends are challenging. It absolutely puts pressure on founders and teams, and I think it's undeniable that there is a vicious cycle where that pressure creates fewer founders and teams that sends a negative message across the board. On our side, one of the things that we've thought about is, again, we think about infrastructure programs and ecosystem. So we've got this great building that we run and operate, but it is a business. And so how can we work with partners to both increase access to this infrastructure that we think will help accelerate teams, but not also do so in a way that is dependent on charging more for it, right? So, we've had a lot of initial conversations with public partners and philanthropic partners about how to increase access and if that's supporting, a lab bench at a time in target technologies that are key for driving growth and solving big challenges that society faces. Like, great, then we can leverage our infrastructure not just for the next great founder that comes in, but for the next great founder in an area where private capital seems to be pulling back, but maybe philanthropic and public capital can fill the gap a little bit.
And so related to that, given the current climate we're in terms of what is the one thing that you would hope that changes in the way that policymakers or the public kind of perceive tough tech, and how, if you could speak to a little bit how tough tech also sort of feeds into some of our larger goals around national security and,
Yeah, so I think I think the biggest thing from my perspective that I'd love policymakers and leaders, just generally to see when they see tough tech, is not just the next thing, right? I think especially policymakers, and I say this as, a former and recovering one myself, right? But government is a bubble, and it's a hard to pierce bubble at times. Just like any of our sectors are, right? Like we talk to people in our sector, we use jargon, we talk about the same things. But I think in particular, the bubble that keeps policymakers and tech leaders, founders, ecosystem participants from talking to one another, is one that we've got to find a way to get through, because I think there's a ton of alignment, right? When I see the teams that I get to work with in this building every day, right? Like they are effectively producing solutions to every one of the big challenges that people face. When I first got here and we were briefing a legislative leader in Massachusetts, he joked and he said, every time you go through a slide, you've got a solution to another problem I face. And he said, well, do you have anything on heating? And I looked at my colleague and we kind of laughed because the next one was Quays, who does deep geothermal. And I said, well, yeah, here's the next slide, right? And I think when you see that, it's not just, and this is like no shot at companies that have done this, but like it's not just the next app. Like this is the way to solve that big problem that you've got. And I think as a policymaker, when you see that, it changes how you approach a problem, right? You're not, how do we make this thing happen, right? Like, I need to come up with a decarbonized heat solution. How do we make this happen? Versus like, oh, it's there. How do I enable that? And that's just a completely different framework. And I think it's one where everyone can listen better and understand the different perspectives that actors are bringing to it, all who could have the same exact goals but who could either not know that one another exist or could just flat out be talking past one another.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you so much for all your time today, Ben. We've definitely learned a lot from you, and really excited about the work that the MIT engine is doing, especially with the Builder platform, and hope that it'll go from strength to strength, regardless of the climate that we're surrounded by. And just to kind of, we always like to end, our conversations with, is there anything that's top of mind for you in terms of a new, a book on innovation that you've read, or something that keeps you up at night or excites you recently?
So as someone who, cares deeply about the teams we get to work with and loves that work, but also has a policy background, especially in climate, but I think this is true across tough tech. The thing I worry about is implementation. It's not like, do we have the solutions? Yep, we've got the solutions. Um, and I think the inability to get from a solution, whether it's in a lab to get it funded. All right, we've focused on that, and I think, through a lot of different partners, and the venture team at Engine Ventures and plenty of other partners there, like they've helped enable that and make that possible. Great. Now this next step of like get that solution out into the world, and what does implementation look like? And I think that's especially true in climate, where not only do we have a ticking clock on um, just sort of within the time that we have here to do this work. But you've got the scientific ticking clock, right? And trying to think about um, how we get the solutions we know we have more quickly out there into the world. Like the last thing that I want to do is be sitting with my boys, 50 years from now, if I'm still around, and have them say, well, wait a second, like you guys had all the solutions, but like Fusion was stuck in an interconnection queue, and like the utility said it was going to take 18 months to plug in. Like that's why you didn't hit the climate goal, was like paperwork. Like you got to
Yeah.
be right. So like to me, like that's it. And that's the thing I lose sleep about. But I like, and that's, if anyone wants to read more on that, if you like, fired up, I love Jen Pahlka's book, Recoding America, right? Like I just think that's it's heavy government and policy, but I think it's got a lot of implications for how we use technology to actually make government work better and build trust and repair some of the divides in our society, and get back to solving problems.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. It's been a very inspiring conversation, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Saba. Appreciate it.